Now I'm thrilled to bring in our first guest, Bill Johnson, General Manager, WRTI Radio in Philadelphia, and so much more. Bill, thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here.
Where'd you go?
Waiting for permissions on the video. There we go.
There we go. So Bill, just to kind of kick things off, just start big picture if you don't mind, and talk a little bit about, you wear so many hats, but talk a little bit about the kind of the day job had at RTI and sort of where that fits into some of the other work that you've been doing for quite some time.
Sure. You're right about a lot of hats, so let me just get the right one on here. WRTI is a jazz and classical station here in Philadelphia. We're a non-commercial public media station, and I'm the general manager. And what that means is I'm generally responsible for everything. And in particular, I think the challenge of having a station that's half classical and half jazz and all music is is special. We were the first station like that in the country back in 1997. Now I think we're up to 3. And what you quickly realize is what you have is you have 2 full-time stations, with 24 hours in the day. So you immediately recognize you're underserving people who love one or the other. And for us, we've been able to kind of bridge the gap, and about 1/3 of our audience actually listens to both classical and jazz, which is really satisfying given when we started the format. I think we had about 2 or 3% of the audience listening to both classical and jazz. And now today to have it at 1/3 of the audience, and that's been true for almost 15 years. It's just really satisfying. I think it's a testament to the idea that if you don't get locked into a particular genre and you just remind people, look, it's the same music, or it's the same notes. We organize them differently, but give it a try, open up your mind, and you might hear something that you identify with that sort of drags you in and introduces you to a new world of expression. So we're really satisfied, to have reached that point. For me, my job is really the stress and anxiety of keeping it all going every day, all day long. We belong to Temple University. They own the license. It's a big major market with a lot of incredible music makers and musicians. And this notion that, in order to meet our mission, which is to champion music as a vital cultural resource, if we really embrace that, it's a huge job. So I think every day, all day long, we all are challenged by, are we living up to that? What are we missing? And there's always something more you could be doing. And we're just sort of in an endless search to try to get to that point of what's the next thing that we can do to make a difference for the music community.
I think something that we talk a lot about in this program, and we think a lot about, and you and I have talked about a bunch, is as we kind of think about the evolution of public radio away from being a radio station that has a license and a signal and a tower and the rest of that, and into sort of the language that, again, Tom Mara and our friends at KXP talk a lot about being a locally based music nonprofit that is multifaceted. And I think one thing that's interesting that I don't know that people think about, maybe everybody thinks about it, I just don't talk about it, but the sort of historical anomaly that so many of our public radio stations do have that educational anchor that are embedded in Temple, which has, of course, this broader mission beyond having a radio station. And could you talk a little bit about like how you think about your core mission as an organization and how it relates to being part of the university community?
Sure. The reality is, I think all of us as music stations are cultural institutions, especially in public media, where the first thing we think about is service. And I think that's, frankly, it sounds kind of obvious now, but I don't think it has been as obvious in the past. I think we have thought of ourselves as radio stations. But the reality is we are touching communities in so many different ways. We work with so many presenters and individual musicians and educators that we are part of the fabric of the local cultural community. And as we broaden our awareness that we're cultural institutions, that actually changes the relationship we have with our license holders. In our case, a university, and most public stations are owned by universities, educational licensees. And so we are always thinking about our role as a steward and a representative of Temple University and their mission. How are we representing the university in the work that we do? Is this, a good example of Temple's values? So you're carrying that it's not weight, but you're carrying that responsibility as part of your own organizations, mission and values and public statements. So it's not a dual identity. And when it works well, they dovetail, right? Mm-hmm. When it works really well, it's I belong to an institution that's dedicated to public service and is really dedicated to the community and really wants to make a difference. Mm-hmm. And in all of those things, we can find ourselves in public media. And so there's lots of common ground to create language that, supports both of those narratives, at the station level, at the university level. I think when it doesn't work well, you've got a more transactional existence. And that's really one of the big barriers is, are you in a situation where you can be guided by your mission? Or are you in a situation where you're more controlled day by day by rules and regulations and compliance and transactional things that may take you off point from your mission? Mm-hmm. Or at the very least, slow you down, right? In terms of pursuing that mission because you're just sort of bogged down in checking off those boxes. So it's a challenging thing. And I know that there's a lot of different flavors of relationships between stations and universities. So it's definitely not monolithic. Some of us have pretty good relationships, like I think RTI and Temple do. But I know others, if you're in a school of communications, for instance, they have a very academic approach mm-hmm. to their relationship with their public media station, in which case you're going to have more involvement by faculty and students, in the academic side. We happen to report to the business side of the university. Right. So we tend to have a more business approach, which is great for me because 90% of our money comes from outside of Temple University, and I need to be able to think like a business as opposed to a department within a university. So it's all over the place.
And building off that, I mean, this notion of thinking as a business and thinking about mission, I think a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated, quote unquote, the 25th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act, which did a lot of things. One of the things it did is it directly paved the way for massive consolidation in the commercial radio space and fundamentally changed the role that commercial radio played in music and culture, which created space for non-com to kind of jump in and take that, and I'm curious, how you would think about that sort of evolution over the last couple, maybe 15, 20 years of non-com radio kind of stepping in that void that was left by the commercial sectors. They kind of became more, they lost live and local, they shuttered mm-hmm. genres, things like that.
Yeah. For us, it's a very direct, effect, right? We went from being an all jazz station to a half jazz, half classical station in 1997. You can connect the dots, and that happened because the commercial classical station was sold a bunch of times in a 2.5 year period. And they were able to survive holding on to the format each time until the last time, right? And that last time, somebody bought it and said, hey, I'm switching the format and there's no more classical music in Philadelphia. Boom, done. That's it. Yeah. And I still hear from people who say, the 10 days without classical music on the radio in 1997 were the worst 10 days of my life. It had that big an impact on them. And so I often use that as an example of what differentiates us, from commercial radio is, we wake up every day thinking about how to sustain, the music and the service that we have on the air and how to serve. And, I don't want to, vilify, commercial media, but that's not the primary motivation. It's to make money. And so we just need to understand the roles that we each play in the system. And so I think it's naive to expect commercial private, media to be in the service business. They are in the profit-making business. And if we want to care for music and we want to care for communities and the artists, I think public media has stepped in to say, we are the people who, no matter what, will figure this out. We will find a way. And I've seen examples of stations that have bought local theaters, in order to keep music presented. I've seen examples of stations who have stepped up and have tens of thousands of students served each year in schools. I just think that, starting from a place of mission and service means that we can really have the biggest impact on the music ecosystem. And we should own that. And I go back to, I don't think we always have. And I think that's hurt us as a business because it's meant we've left a lot of money on the table And we've lost a lot of ground in terms of making the case for who we are, but we're catching up pretty quick.
Yeah. And this notion of service leads me to, Jazz Philadelphia and sort of the community building, infrastructure building efforts that you've been involved in locally. Could you talk us through Jazz Philadelphia and kind of what that strategy has looked like?
Sure. I'd say a few years ago, there was an effort underway by the Wingcoat Foundation to better understand the jazz ecosystem in Philadelphia. And they funded some research, which was pretty comprehensive. And a lot of us were interviewed to talk about our roles in the jazz ecosystem, whether it was broadcasting, whether it was musicians, whether it was presenters, whether it was the city of Philadelphia businesses. And out of that came a body of research that allowed them to come up with a conclusion of, what we need to do is we need to put together a team of people in Philadelphia, who represent these various constituent groups. And more importantly, this team of people need to check their egos at the door. They need to be people who are committed to the bigger ideal of furthering jazz in Philadelphia. And even more than that, they need to be committed to the idea that the only way you can do that is by engaging in something called collective impact. And so spending the time to really talk to the community, hold the meetings, build the working groups so that they can have a voice in representing what their interests are. And that becomes the agenda for Jazz Philadelphia. And so that's what was done. And, it's still a work in progress. Collective impact is an arduous, way to build anything. But what you end up with is something that is representative of the needs of your community because they've been involved and engaged from day one. Mm-hmm. And so that's what Jazz Philadelphia is it's designed to lift all boats, in the jazz community. It is designed to be of service to all its constituents in the jazz community. We're not interested in competing. We are interested in serving, and we're interested in listening. And so to that end, all of the programs that we've created have been designed to try to achieve that. And it's arguable whether we're succeeding, every day in every way. But I'd like to think that we are moving the needle on that. And, it's slow, but it's steady progress and it's hard progress. But our team has done an amazing job. Heather Blakesley, who's the executive director, and Gerald Veasley, the great bassist, who was the president. I just think they've both done an extraordinary job of focusing all of us on here's some concrete things that we think actually represent what we're hearing in collective impact and make for a healthier jazz community.
It's so great and been such an inspiration, I think to all of us, because again, collective impact is such a great framing for it, because that's really what we're trying to do. It's all it's about accountability. It's about leveraging assets. It's about visioning. It's about lifting each other up. The music community has in many cases, a reputation for just being cutthroat and zero-sum game. And if somebody's doing well, someone's getting hurt, and it's we're not going to thrive and build that kind of world we'd like to build if we're not, really trying to put the pieces together.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the smartest things that came out of the Wingcoat research was simply this idea of putting together a group of people who truly were trying to do the best thing they could for jazz. Yeah. Even though you had a club owner in the room, and even though you had a musician in the room, and you had an educator, we all looked at each other and we just said, all of those things get checked at the door, and we're going to sit around this table and we're going to try to do our best to serve. Yeah. We're not perfect, but I like to think that wisdom to put us together in that way with that direction, helped get to where we are. And it certainly helped us embrace the collective impact model. Like if you're just sitting there because, you're counting the hours or the days or the weeks until, you can take advantage of what's being created, for your club or for your next gig or whatever, it's just the wrong mindset. It's just absolutely the wrong mindset in order for this to work. So we're very fortunate to have an amazing team of people who have just come together with that mentality and continue to have it to this day. Here we are years later, and everybody who's involved continues to be asking the question, like, how can we continue to serve, this community and make a difference for the people we care about?
And we're going to revisit this later in the show, and we're going to talk to Hal about some of the work with Save Our Stages. But, part of, again, what we talk a lot about in this program is what are the implications of this sort of, revelatory moment of advocacy and awareness that the shutdown has led to, that people are really thinking about and talking about and advocating, not just for music, but for arts and culture in ways that, maybe we'll finally have the breakthrough we've been hoping for a long time, which is, let's not look at this through sort of a commercial market lens or a consumer lens, but let's really have the re-articulation of why this stuff matters and what we collectively can and should do and need to do to make it happen, other than just, rely on end stage capitalism to kind of make it all work.
Well, that's a
long wait. And then we're going to bring Hal in, and then we'll bring you back to talk more about Philadelphia. But I was really excited to read the announcement about your inclusion, WRTI's inclusion in the Jazz Media Lab. Could you talk a little bit about what that initiative is and where that work's going to go?
I'm excited too. Not unlike the Wincoat research, Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, sat down and did some hard work a few years ago of saying, we want to better understand jazz in America, the jazz ecosystem. And to me, it's like, when people with money come to the table and say, we care about this and we're willing to do the work and do it in the right way, that's when change can happen. And so that's what Doris Duke did. And at the time, they were really just talking to all of us, just trying to understand. We got notified last year that out of that, they had decided to make some strategic investments and create this thing called the Jazz Media Lab, which is 5 stations around the country, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, Denver, New York, and Philadelphia. And we are a cohort of 5 non-commercial stations who are working together. We're meeting on a regular basis. We're sharing information. There's research that's being done. And we're really trying to figure out how we can make a bigger difference in our own communities, but also model some things that other stations can take advantage of in the system and around the country. And so it's a sustained effort of 3 years of funding from Doris Duke, which again is a sign of how smart they are. They realize if you just get this 1 year, you're one and done, you're not really going to be focused on it. So the sustained investment allows us to be able to sort of free ourselves from day to day and seriously embrace this idea of what can we do together that we cannot do separately, that can only be done at scale and can only be done if we dedicate time and energy to talk to each other, think it through, work with each other, and take some risks, which is also part of the Duke grant, is they've included some capital to actually do some risk taking, which so many of us can't afford to do. So it's just a very smart, forward-thinking way to support jazz in America, and we're excited to be on the front end of it. We only had 2 meetings. We've got another one next week, so I'm looking forward to that.
And I'm really excited as a music fan. I always, jokingly say I'm sort of jazz curious. And the challenge with jazz criticism is if you don't understand, if you're not deep enough into it to understand the references, and so played with so-and-so and did this with this. And it's, now we've got this opportunity, of course, for experiential learning, and we can engage in things that were never before possible. And to see the leveraging of the passion and the expertise to figure out what could be done that we just haven't got our head around. And again, obviously we're just huge fans of the cohort model. And, everything about this last, year has been just a nightmare, but Zoom has created opportunities to do these multi-city cohorts and collaborations that really were not possible via conference calls. So
that is the silver lining out of all of this. I think we've learned that we can work together, in ways that it's not that they weren't possible before, but we weren't doing it. Yeah. Right. And now that we've been forced to do it, we're discovering that there's a lot of rich territory there. And so I think that's sort of the lasting effect of all of this, is that, we will continue to do that. We will continue not to hesitate to say, oh, no, they're in Portland. Sure, we can do something. We can talk. And that's not our inclination, because we're broadcasters and we're in one market and we're very focused on serving that market. So the entire mentality tends to shape itself around that. But it's important to open it up to a bigger perspective, because, again, there are only things we can do at scale. And when it comes to jazz, it's only good music and bad music, just like all other music. And the more we can break away from this idea that you need to know all this inside baseball stuff, the more we're going to make it appealing to a greater number of people. And that's true, frankly, with all music, as far as I'm concerned. It's definitely true with classical. Right. Any music where we have a history of putting up walls. Mm-hmm. You have ears. Everybody, has ears for the most part. And what you hear is what you hear. And if you like it, you like it. And it's legitimate and it's valid, period. Now, if you want to learn more and go deeper, by all means, learn more and go deeper, but there shouldn't be a barrier, to participating in it based on a set of knowledge that somehow you need to acquire in order to just simply like something.
I think that's exactly right. And just a quick shout out to the platforms that you've been helping build in terms of the Non-Com Music Alliance and the idea of public radio stations across the country who are music facing kind of coming together into more of a collaborative environment. So there's now infrastructure that, as the Media Lab is coming up with ideas and innovations, that people are more networked, not in terms of programming networks, but in terms of leadership collaborations and those type of things. So
yeah, and that's definitely happening here in Philadelphia. I'll give a shout out to XPN. Hal will be on shortly. But XPN and an organization called Rec Philly here in Philadelphia, we all got together and did Black Music City, which is a phenomenal program that hopefully we can talk about later. But it's a perfect example of what can be done at a time like this, when people come together to do something that we weren't thinking of doing prior to the pandemic.
Awesome. Well, Bill, if you don't mind sticking around, we'll bring you back in a few minutes to talk some other Philadelphia stuff.